3 words ended a peace process that took 60 days to build, and it took less than 3 seconds to say them. The deal is over. That's not a headline. That's a detonation. And almost nobody watching the news tonight understands why those 4 words matter more than the 90 missile strikes that followed them. Here's what you're being told. Iran attacked oil tankers in the Strait of Hormuz. America retaliated. A ceasefire collapsed. Tragic, but simple. An eye for an eye. A war reignited by provocation. Here is what you're not being told. This was never a ceasefire in the way you think of one. It was a 60-day financial instrument disguised as a peace agreement. And the moment it stopped serving its economic function, it was designed to fail. You are not watching a war restart. You are watching a pressure valve get deliberately reopened. Every major news network is covering this as a security story. Missiles, targets, casualties. That's the surface. Underneath the surface is a mechanism of economic coercion so old it predates the automobile and so precise that the timing of Trump's NATO summit remarks, delivered not from the White House, not from the Pentagon, but from a stage in Ankara, Turkey, was not an accident. It was theater aimed at an audience of one, the global oil market. So the real question isn't why is Iran attacking ships? The real question is, why did the United States wait exactly until day 21 of a 60-day truce? Wait until a temporary oil sanctions waiver was still active? Wait until Iran's entire political apparatus was consumed by the funeral of its own supreme leader? And then declare the deal dead? Timing like that isn't reactive. It's engineered. Over the next 30 minutes, we're going to take this apart piece by piece. The economic law underneath it, the counterintuitive move nobody in mainstream media is naming, and the fatal miscalculation that could turn a controlled escalation into something neither side can walk back. Stay with this. What you're about to hear is not being said on any evening broadcast. To understand what just happened, you have to stop thinking about this as a war between 2 countries and start thinking about it as a stress test on a single geographic choke point that the entire global economy is structurally dependent on. The Strait of Hormuz is roughly 21 miles wide at its narrowest point. Through that gap passes somewhere around a fifth of the world's oil consumption every single day. It is, without exaggeration, the single most consequential piece of water on the planet. Whoever controls the perception of risk in that strait controls a lever on the global price of energy. Okay, and by extension, a lever on inflation, on shipping costs, on every economy that doesn't produce its own oil. This is the first structural law you need to understand. Choke point economics. Wars over open territory are wars of attrition. Wars over choke points are wars of leverage. You don't need to occupy the Strait of Hormuz to control it. You only need to make the cost of insuring a tanker through it unpredictable. Uncertainty is the weapon, not the missile, the insurance premium. Now overlay the second structural law, what historians and international relations theorists call the Thucydides trap. The idea, first articulated by the Greek historian describing Athens and Sparta, that when a rising power threatens to displace an established one, war becomes not just possible but structurally probable, almost regardless of the specific triggering incident. The specific incident is never really the cause. It's the excuse the underlying structure was waiting for. Substitute Athens and Sparta for the Islamic Republic and the American-led order in the Gulf, and you get the same shape. Iran, since the fall of its supreme leader on the opening day of this war back in February, has not been fighting to expand. It has been fighting to survive as a coherent state. The United States, meanwhile, is not fighting to conquer Iranian territory. It is fighting to prevent Iran from ever again being able to threaten the choke point that keeps global energy markets stable. That is not a war about ideology. That is a war about infrastructure control. Now bring in the third piece, the petrodollar architecture. For half a century, global oil has been priced and settled predominantly in US dollars. That single fact is one of the quiet, load-bearing walls of American financial dominance. It's part of why the dollar remains the world's reserve currency, why the US can run deficits other nations couldn't dream of sustaining, why treasury bonds remain the planet's safe asset of choice. Any actor that threatens to disrupt the oil trade, whether by blockading a choke point, pricing crude outside the dollar system, or simply making the flow of oil unreliable enough that alternative arrangements start looking attractive, is not committing a military provocation. They're committing a systemic provocation. And systemic provocations get answered differently than territorial ones. They get answered with overwhelming, rapid, and continuous force because the goal isn't to win a battle. The goal is to remove the uncertainty from the market as fast as possible. This is why, when Iranian state media reported strikes hitting targets across Bushehr, Bandar Abbas, Sirik, and Keshm Island, ports, piers, a telecommunications tower, a fishing fleet, you should not read that as random destruction. Read it as the systematic dismantling of Iran's capacity to ever again threaten that 21-mile gap. Coastal radar, naval staging points, Command and control nodes near the water. This is not carpet bombing. This is surgical removal of choke point leverage. And then there's Kharg Island, Iran's primary oil export terminal, the loading point for the overwhelming majority of its crude. When Trump told reporters, referring to strikes there, I said, "Don't touch the oil." That single sentence is one of the most revealing things said in this entire conflict. It tells you the strategic logic in one breath. The United States is not trying to destroy Iran's ability to sell oil. It is trying to destroy Iran's ability to weaponize the sale and transport of oil. There's a difference. One is economic warfare. The other is economic policing. This is the mechanism most coverage misses entirely. Sanctions and strikes aren't opposite tools here. They're the same tool used in two different registers. The reimposition of oil sanctions, timed to hit the same week as the strikes, removes Iran's financial ability to fund retaliation. The strikes remove its physical ability to execute retaliation. Together, they're not two separate escalations. They're a single coordinated compression, squeezed from both directions at once. That's the anatomy. Now, let's get to what almost nobody is saying out loud. The official narrative says Iran attacked tankers, so America struck back. That's the sequence everyone agrees on. But sequence is not the same thing as cause. Most people see a retaliation. Analysts who've watched this pattern before see something closer to a financial reckoning disguised as a security response. Here's the counterintuitive fact. The ceasefire itself contained the seeds of its own controlled demolition, and it was written that way on purpose. When the memorandum of understanding was signed in mid-June, it came bundled with something the headlines barely mentioned. A 60-day full waiver on oil sanctions, allowing Iran to sell crude on the open market during the negotiation window. On paper, that's a goodwill gesture, a way to ease the energy crisis the war itself had caused and give diplomacy room to breathe. In practice, it did something else. It gave Iran a temporary, narrow financial lifeline, just enough oxygen to keep its economy from fully collapsing, but nowhere near enough to rebuild strategic depth. A controlled bleed, not a wound and not a cure. 60 days is not a diplomatic number. 60 days is a market number. It's roughly the length of time needed to let panic-driven oil prices normalize, let shipping insurers recalibrate risk premiums downward, let the initial shock of the February war fully price out of futures markets, and then reintroduce uncertainty at a moment when the market has just stabilized enough that a fresh shock produces maximum volatility and therefore maximum leverage for whoever reintroduces it. Watch the timeline again, but this time, watch it as a trader would, not as a journalist would. The waiver was granted with an expiration date of August 21st. The sanctions were reimposed on July 7th, 6 weeks early. Why detonate a financial mechanism before its own deadline? Because the other clock running in parallel, the funeral of Ayatollah Khamenei, killed on the opening day of this war back in February, had just reached its most theatrically vulnerable moment. Days of mourning processions through Najaf and Qom, a nation's attention and its command structure oriented inward, toward grief and succession, not outward toward defense posture. La narrativa oficial dice que Estados Unidos respondió a un ataque. Pero la realidad es que Estados Unidos esperó al momento de máxima fragilidad interna de Irán. Un liderazgo decapitado, un pueblo de luto, una economía apenas respirando gracias a una ventana de exención que ellos mismos habían diseñado. Y entonces cerró la ventana. That is not retaliation. That is timing discipline. And here's the piece that should genuinely unsettle you. Iran's supreme leadership has not been formally reconstituted. The man killed in February has not been replaced through any normal institutional process. What's emerging instead, quietly, through ceremonial gestures rather than formal announcement, is the shadow of a hereditary transition, with his son positioned at commemorations described as being held under the auspices of a new supreme authority without an explicit confirmation of succession. A regime is trying to conduct total war and a leadership transition simultaneously, without ever formally admitting the transition is happening. That is not strength. That is an institution running on inertia, hoping momentum disguises the vacancy at its center. This is the counterintuitive read the mainstream segment will never give you. Iran's retaliatory strikes on shipping in the Strait and its drone attacks toward Bahrain and Kuwait are not signs of a confident actor executing strategy. They are signs of a fragmented command structure trying to prove it still has a strategy, internally to its own population as much as externally to Washington. When the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps calls it a crushing response, listen to the audience of that phrase. It's not primarily aimed at Washington. It's aimed at Tehran, at Qom, at a population watching to see if the state they're mourning under still has teeth. That reframes everything. This isn't two rational actors locked in mutual deterrence. This is one actor, the United States, executing a patient, choke point-focused compression strategy against another actor, Iran, that is simultaneously fighting a war, burying its head of state, and managing an unacknowledged succession all at once, with a fraction of its financial and command capacity intact. Asymmetry like that doesn't produce a stable equilibrium. It produces one of two outcomes: capitulation or a catastrophic miscalculation born of desperation. And desperate actors under structural pressure have a well-documented historical habit of escalating in ways that look irrational from the outside, but feel like the only remaining option from the inside, because their audience isn't strategic anymore. It's domestic, it's existential. That is the forbidden read of this moment. You are not watching a ceasefire fail. You are watching a controlled compression campaign, timed against the target's weakest possible internal moment, executed through the joint mechanism of sanctions and strikes, dressed up in the media as a retaliatory skirmish. Let's map the board the way the strategists in both capitals are actually mapping it, not the way the evening news maps it. Washington's position. The United States holds overwhelming conventional and financial dominance. Its stated logic, in Trump's own words, is binary. Either a deal gets made or the job gets finished. That framing is deliberately reductive because it forecloses the middle ground diplomacy usually lives in. There is no announced third option. That's a negotiating posture. But it's also a trap of its own, because binary framing removes off-ramps not just for Iran, but for the United States as well. Once you've publicly declared there are only two outcomes, backing toward a negotiated middle becomes politically costly. You've spent your own flexibility to buy leverage. Washington's fatal error, if there is one, is this. It is assuming a rational, unified counterpart on the other side of the table, at precisely the moment that counterpart has stopped being unified. Choke point compression strategy works beautifully against a coherent state actor that can calculate costs and benefits and choose de-escalation when the math favors it. It works far less predictably against a fragmented actor whose internal factions, the clerical establishment, the IRGC, a not yet formalized succession, may not agree on what rational even means right now. You cannot deter an actor by threatening consequences. It can calculate if that actor's internal decision-making has already stopped calculating and started performing. Tehran's position. Iran's counter-strategy has been to weaponize the one asset it still fully controls: geography. It cannot match American air power. It cannot match American financial reach. But it can make the Strait of Hormuz feel unsafe, which is a different and in some ways cheaper form of leverage, because insurance markets react to perceived risk almost as violently as they react to actual damage. 3 tankers hit, a handful of projectiles near port infrastructure. That's a small physical footprint with an outsized market footprint. Brent crude jumped over 5% in the immediate aftermath of just the rhetoric about the deal collapsing, before most of the strikes had even been assessed. That's Iran's fatal error mirrored back. It is treating market disruption as a form of deterrence, when in an environment of total war, market disruption functions instead as justification for total dismantlement. In peacetime, spooking the oil market is leverage. It makes adversaries want to negotiate you back to stability. In an active war, spooking the oil market simply gives the stronger side a global economic mandate, not just a security mandate, to remove your capacity to do it again. Every tanker strike doesn't buy Iran negotiating room. It buys the United States permission, in the eyes of insurers, allies, and its own domestic audience, to escalate further, because now the justification isn't abstract regional security. It's protecting global energy flows, a much harder narrative for the rest of the world to oppose. The countermove nobody is discussing on air. Watch the Gulf states. Bahrain and Kuwait sounding sirens, scrambling air defenses against Iranian drones. These are not incidental casualties of the US-Iran fight. They are the pressure points Iran is using to try to internationalize the cost of American strikes, to make Washington's Gulf allies feel the war rather than just watch it. If Bahrain or Kuwait sustain significant damage or casualties, the political calculus shifts again, not toward de-escalation, but toward a wider coalition response. Because an attack on a Gulf Cooperation Council state pulls in a different set of alliance obligations than an attack on Iran alone did. That's the real fork in the road, and it's not the one being discussed in prime time. The question isn't, does the US-Iran war restart? It already has. The real question is whether this stays a bilateral compression campaign, contained to Iranian territory and shipping lanes, or whether Iran's drone and missile responses toward Bahrain and Kuwait pull the Gulf states into direct combatant status, at which point you're no longer looking at a choke point war. You're looking at a regional war with multiple sovereign militaries, and by extension, a far higher probability of a miscalculated strike that neither side intended. A downed civilian aircraft, a misidentified vessel, a strike that hits a facility nobody planned to hit. Historically, wars anchored around choke points rarely stay contained purely because both sides want containment. They stay contained when they do, because the compressing side achieves its objective fast enough that the compressed side capitulates before the conflict has time to metastasize into neighboring territory. The moment that timeline stretches, The moment either side starts believing this is a war of endurance rather than a war of a few sharp weeks, every additional day increases the probability of an uncontrolled trigger event. Not because anyone wants total regional war, because systems under sustained stress generate errors, and errors in a theater this densely packed with military assets, oil infrastructure, and civilian shipping lanes tend not to stay small. That's the cold calculation underneath the headlines. This is not a story about whether Iran or America wins. It's a story about whether a choke point compression strategy can complete its objective before the system. Its operating inside generates an accident large enough to change the entire nature of the conflict. Strip away the missile counts, the statements from podiums, the sirens over Manama and Kuwait City, and what you're left with is a structure, not a story. A choke point the world cannot function without. A currency system quietly dependent on who controls the flow of oil through that choke point. A rising asymmetry between one actor with overwhelming conventional and financial power and another actor whose command structure is, right now, more ceremonial than functional. And a 60-day clock that was never really about diplomacy. It was about giving markets just enough time to relax before being shocked again at the moment of maximum vulnerability for the weaker side. The deal is over is not a diplomatic failure. It's the closing of a financial instrument that had already done its job, buying time, managing the initial post-war oil shock, and waiting for Iran's weakest institutional moment to arrive on schedule. What happens next depends on one variable. Almost nobody's tracking closely enough. Whether Iran's fragmented leadership interprets continued compression as a signal to fold, or as a signal that folding and dying are functionally the same outcome, in which case there's nothing left to lose by escalating toward the Gulf states directly. Cornered actors with nothing left to lose are the single most dangerous variable in any structural conflict, because they stop responding to deterrence and start responding to narrative, the story they need their own people to believe about how the end was written. Every intelligence assessment worth reading right now isn't asking whether the US can defeat Iran militarily. That was never in question. It's asking whether Tehran's internal fracture lines break toward capitulation or toward a final unbounded response with nothing held in reserve. The mainstream story is a ceasefire that collapsed. The structural story is a pressure system that was always going to be reopened on a schedule at the moment it would hurt the most. You weren't watching a war restart tonight. You were watching a countdown finish.